Welcome to the No Truth Without Beauty Discovery series. Let's hear what author Lina Al-Ali has for us. How would you characterize the rights of women today in most Muslim communities?
Well, unfortunately, we've gone from a situation where the Muslim world was ahead of the curve, really, by not even a couple of centuries. We're talking over a millennium on a number of issues, such as divorce rights, the ownership of property, the right of women to inherit, and even in interfaith marriage, civil marriage, which is something we don't talk very much about. So we've gone from being well ahead of everybody else, ahead of the pack, as it were, on a number of issues, to falling really quite behind. And it's ironic because in many ways we have chosen to sort of adopt a pre-Islamic stance on a number of issues, these issues. Whereas, we typically speak in the negative about all things pre-Islam, and yet, when the Qur'an came along and offered women all of these rights, for various reasons, our cultures have chosen to just set them aside and interpret them in a very selective way.
What about inheritance? You have an interesting take on the Quran's inheritance laws as applied to women.
I really enjoyed researching this book, and the experience was full of wonderful surprises, and one of them was to discover that women got the right to inherit basically because they lobbied for it. They got organized basically, and they advocated for themselves, which was a really interesting thing to discover. So basically, at the time, in Arabia, only adult men would inherit. That was the custom, because only adult men were in a position to fight and defend the tribe. Remember, this was a part of the world and a time when there was tribal warfare all the time. There were limited resources in the desert, and they were always at each other's throats, as it were. And that was the custom. So old men didn't inherit, children didn't inherit, whether they were boy or girl. And it was the women who went to the Prophet and said, but the men are able to go off and fight because we stay behind and take care of everything, and because we make it possible for them to be strong, and we organize things so that they can go off. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to go off and defend the tribe. So we are also contributing to defending the tribe and the community. And it was in response to that, really, that God, sent down some verses whereby women would now inherit. And it's very interesting because the terminology used by God in the Quran is to say, to each what they have earned. So it's a recognition of work, which it's not a gift, it's they have earned it. And of course, it's this also sort of ties in with this question of the right to work. I mean, if that was recognized as work, then surely other kinds of work should be recognized as work. Because, of course, we know that in many communities, people still don't like women to work at all. Now, we get caught up with the inheritance issue because we all hear about the headline verse whereby a daughter receives only half of what a son receives. And, and this is something that I talk about quite a bit in the book, which is methodology, how to read the Quran. Instead of zeroing in on one verse, this one, for example, and saying, oh my goodness, a daughter only gets half of what a son gets, Islam is terrible to women. Well, shouldn't we look at everything, all of the verses in the Quran that speak about inheritance? Because there are 11 verses that speak of inheritance. And if we look at all of them together, we see that actually, despite that headline, daughter gets half of what a son gets, that things are actually much more nuanced. For example, 3 of those 11 verses talk about why and what the conditions are for that ratio, that 2-to-1 ratio to hold. And this has been, talked about more and more by scholars today, and many of them have pointed this out, and there's greater awareness of it. It's conditional on men providing for the family. Back then, and in many cases today also, it is the man who provides for his wife and children. It is the son who provides for his parents and his ailing parents. That burden does not fall on the daughter or on the wife. So in that context, the ratio makes sense, and the Qur'an is very clear about that conditionality. But we unfortunately forget about that and zero in on the headline 2-to-1 ratio. The other thing to point out in this respect is that when we think of inheritance, we tend to think of a vertical line of inheritance where a person is inheriting from above, from the parents. But in the Islamic system, it's much more complex. It was designed to spread the wealth and reduce income inequality. So there's inheritance coming from the parents, but there's also inheritance coming from the children, because remember, it was a time when a lot of the male sons would die, and there were a lot of parents would be left bereaved, so they would inherit upwards, as it were, from their children, and then every person inherits sideways from their spouse and sometimes from their siblings as well. So taking the whole of it, we find actually quite a few situations where a given woman would inherit as much as a man, or more than a man. I mean, it depends on who's at play in the equation when the inheritance is being divvied up. So, for example, there are scenarios where you have bereaved parents, and both parents inherit equally from the son who has unfortunately died. There are cases when the bereaved mother, would inherit more than the bereaved father. So it's much more complex than that headline 2-to-1. Nowadays, there's more and more talk of revisiting the daughter gets half of what a son gets, because we know that in many, many situations today, a daughter or a wife contributes significantly to her family. And so the responsibilities have shifted. So there are many scholars who are drawing attention to that conditionality for the 2-to-1 ratio to hold.
Tell us about marriage. Do women have rights that we don't generally talk about or we may be unaware of?
Marriage, of course, is a big topic in the Qur'an, and there's a lot to say about that. I'd like to pick up on just 2 points for the purpose of today's episode. First of all, we've gotten used to thinking of marriage in Islam as being a transactional matter. It's a contract. Oh, it's just a contract, we say. It's not a sacrament. But it's not true. It is a contract on the one hand. It's a social contract because, believe it or not, God wanted to protect women and include things in that contract that would protect her. The bridal gift that is much talked about in Arabic, mahr, is very important. It was introduced in such a way, it already existed, but it was made binding by the Qur'an. It's a gift whereby it's the husband, it's not a dowry, it's not the bride's family, like in many countries and cultures. It's not the bride's family that is offering this to the husband, the would-be groom. It's the other way around. It's the husband who offers this as a bridal gift, as a sort of irreversible bridal gift. He can never take it back. It's hers. And it consists of 2 parts. The part that she gets up front and she states what she wants, and the part that she would get at the end if he divorced her, in case of divorce. So, it is a social contract. There are protections in there, but it's much more than that. It's also, in the terminology of the Qur'an, a sublime institution, if we must call it an institution. The terminology we gloss over very often, but it's quite beautiful, really. It's mates from your own souls. In English we say your soulmate. The Quran literally says that, the mates from your own souls. Why? So that you may find tranquility, love, and compassion with one another. And my personal favorite, you are like clothing to one another, which conjures up this intimacy of enveloping warmth. Clothing being the closest thing to oneself physically. So, it's really, we have to get away, I think, from thinking of it just as a social contract. And again, that's a place where we were ahead of the curve by writing things down and protecting women. But, we seem to have done that, or we've come to think of that at the expense of the sort of the emotional and the virtuous content of marriage. The second thing I would like to mention about marriage is this question of polygyny, whereby a man is allowed up to 4 wives in the Qur'an. Again, we tend to read things in isolation, and we have a habit of not reading, everything the Quran has to say about a given topic, but sometimes we don't read the verses just before and just after, a given verse to get the context. And in this case, we don't even tend to read the whole verse to get the full context, because where the Quran permits taking on a 2nd, 3rd, and even a 4th wife is specifically in the case of orphans. Now, orphans in the Quran, today we read orphans and we think children. But orphans at the time meant anyone who did not have a protector. A protector was typically a male protector. In the tribe, you needed to have a protector. The Prophet himself needed a protector when his father died, and his uncle took on that role of being his protector. So this is in the case of women who had lost their protector, the person who provided for them also, whether it was a husband or a father or a brother. So in that context, the Quran offers that solution. God says, in the case of the orphans, the orphaned women, you may take on, a 2nd, 3rd, and 4th wife. It was a way of solving an economic problem, a socio-economic problem, where these women would otherwise be probably sold into slavery back then, or just, kept as captives and as domestic help, with no rights. So the Quran permits that, but then says, but you have to be fair. You have to treat them equally. You have to have the means and the time and the willingness to treat them equally. And then we all know that the Quran goes on to say, and you will not be able to treat them equally. So here's a solution. It's a very hard one to implement, though. And monogamy is, in fact, very much the norm in the Quran. All the talk of mates. Mates means two. Even when in depictions of paradise, you are reunited with your spouse, singular. It's so monogamy is the norm, and in fact, to be fair, in most of the world today, monogamy is the norm.
What about divorce? This is an area where women are known to get a very raw deal pretty much everywhere. Why so?
Divorce is a huge topic of concern for God and the Quran. It's actually quite remarkable. The Quran devotes a large number of consecutive verses in chapter 2 to the question of divorce, and in other chapters addressing different customs that were prevalent at the time, seeking to rectify them. I grew up in the 70s, and we used to watch a lot of Arabic films coming out of Egypt at the time. Wonderful films used to get made, and still do, of course. But I remember there was one famous film, I can't remember its name, but the two main actors, a couple, were having a confrontation, and it was clear that the husband was gearing up to, telling his wife he was going to divorce her. And so, he says, "You are divorced," and the music goes da 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 da. and she is trembling, and then, a few seconds later, divorced, second time. And she's like, beseeching him practically at his feet, no, basically, don't say the third time. And then, of course, the third time comes divorced, and she is distraught. She is just, she collapses, because the third utterance of the word divorce apparently is, that's it, she's divorced, and that's that. And so we're left with this idea that, all it takes is for a man to say, you're divorced, divorced, divorced 3 times in a row in the space of 30 seconds, and that's that. And, but when you read the Qur'an, again, this idea of reading the flow, the context, why is it addressing, the question of divorce? You get a completely different take from it. And this was really an eye-opener for me, because apparently there was a custom back then where men would swear off sexual relations with their wives, but not divorce them. So these women would be left in limbo, sometimes for years, whereby they neither had the full benefits of being married, nor could they move on. And so in that context, the Quran comes along and says, you can, if you swear off your wife, first of all, God introduces the idea of a cooling off period, reflection. It says to the man who may have done this, take 4 months to think about it. If at the end of the 4 months you still want to go ahead and divorce, God understands, and so be it. If you decide to divorce, the woman must wait 3 months before she moves on to getting married, in case she's pregnant, so that the parentage is clear. If you change your mind during that time and you want to do the right thing, then you can. So the divorce is revocable. And then God says, you can change your mind twice. But you can't keep going back and forth, because then what men might do is divorce. She waits for 3 months. Just before the 3 months are up, I've changed my mind. And so it keeps going on. And so the women are left in limbo again through a different route. So look at the extent to which God went to protect women from this kind of abuse. So what the Quran was actually saying is that you can change your mind up to twice, and that divorce is revocable twice. But the third time, that's it. Because, it was a way of putting an end to this whimsical and flippant way of telling women, we're off you, or we're divorcing you, etc. So it's really quite remarkable if you think about it. And it's also important to point out that the Quran made it clear that during that waiting period, a woman is not to be put out of the property, assuming that the property is the husband's to begin with. He cannot throw her out. And there is not just, it's not just rules about divorce that are introduced, but it's also a whole system of behavior etiquette, if you will. God counsels a period of reflection. We've already seen that. And then the waiting period is also a kind of separation before you take the final act at the same time. It serves that purpose. The community has a role to play. So, for example, if the man is being unreasonable in whatever way, and if the woman would like a divorce, this is something also that sometimes we think women don't have the right to divorce, then the community can step in and is encouraged to step in to mediate, to encourage the man to be fair and observe the etiquette that the Quran has laid out. And it's only in the extreme case whereby the man is not being reasonable and he's not listening to anybody, that a woman would then have is offered a mechanism for freeing herself. I mean, imagine, this is the language of the Quran. As a last resort, if the husband is not being reasonable and the community cannot lean on him and convince him to be reasonable and observe the etiquette of the Quran and divorce, then the woman has a last resort, which is to say, here's your bridal gift, I don't want it. And she then has executed a unilateral divorce. She doesn't need his permission, and it is a way for her to free herself. Now, we have come to regard that as the only way that a woman can get a divorce. Whereas in the Quran, it is very clear that that's a last resort if the husband cannot be prevailed upon to be more reasonable. Now, I also want to say that, we read all these verses about divorce in the Quran, and it sounds like God is addressing men. And it's true, he is addressing men. The two particular customs that God is addressing, he's addressing men because they're the ones who used to commit those unfair acts of divorce towards women. So if it sounds like God is addressing men, it's because they were the perpetrators of these customs that God was trying to fix. But that's not to say that women have no rights. And it's very interesting because another one of the beautiful things I discovered during the research is that at one point a group of women went to the Prophet and they said to him, it sounds like God is always addressing the men. What about us? And in Arabic we have the plural you, and we have the singular you, and we have the plural you. But the plural you, when it's for men, there's a masculine plural, and when it's men and women, you use the masculine plural as well, right? I think we talked about this last time. And so, in response to them objecting in this way, this wonderful verse, I think it's one of the most glorious verses in the Quran for me. Anyway, I love it because God goes so far as to say, for believing men and believing women, for fasting men and fasting women, for chaste men and chaste women, for charitable men and charitable women, etc., etc., etc. Repeating men, women, men, women, men, women. God has only forgiveness and good things, in store for such people. And, it's... but is he supposed to say that in every case? I mean, the Quran would be double its length if every time he addressed something in the masculine plural, he had to say, oh, and this also applies to women. And it's strange that we haven't quite understood that some principles are universal in nature. And that what applies to the male also applies to the female.
Thank you for watching. Hope this episode has enticed you to discover the book No Truth Without Beauty, God, the Qur'an, and Women's Rights for yourself. All links are available in the description box below this video.